All right, in this version of the Beginner's Guide to Cinema 4D, we are going to talk about Mograph, which is a pretty unique set of tools to Cinema 4D, though other programs have tried to duplicate it. We'll see how we can get started with this, work with several of the generators, perhaps see a few of the effectors, talk about fields. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so nothing in here to start. We're going to do kind of a around the world when it comes to working with our MoGraph. And as I said, MoGraph is really made up of a few different types of objects. The first of which is our generators, which you'll go through and create a number of, though not all of them. Next, you have your effectors, which allow you to modify your MoGraph geometry. And then lastly, we have fields, which allow us to control the strength of the effector and how it gets applied to our MoGraph geometry. So let's start basic. I'm going to create a cube and then also enable fillet just to make it a little bit better looking. Rounded edges are a little bit more realistic. Increase the fillet radius just a bit as well. And then we can drop this into a cloner, which I can create by just clicking on it. And most of our MoGraph generators, just about all of them, want a child. So an object that we've, put inside the cloner. Sometimes it can be more than one object, as the case is with the cloner. Other times, though, it will just be one. Some, not at all. But the cloner does need to have a child of it. Matrix, not really. Fracture, yes. Voronoi fracture, yes. Tracer, no. Most spline, I'm not 100% certain about that one. Been a while. I think it does want a spline to use. I don't know if it needs to be a child of it, though. And then that just leaves the Mo instance, which does not need a child. So that's a quick rundown there. But as I said, what we can do is take an object and drop it inside of our cloner, and we'll automatically start to see a few copies or clones of whatever we put inside of it. Now we do have a few different modes here. So the default is grid. You can also do radial. Okay, and if you just quickly adjust the radius here, you'll see that it's starting to be in a circle. We can adjust the count as well. We have linear. And as we're starting to see with these different modes, they do have different settings. Typically, it's the number. Also, we have some settings based on the spacing with our clones and what we want done to them. So in the case of linear here, you can see we can change the spacing on the Y, the X, the Z. If we want to rotate each clone a certain amount or scale each clone a certain amount. And similar thing, I'll go back to radial really quick. You can see not only do we have the radius, the count, but also different planes, different orientations. You can also control the start and end angle here as well. Okay, back to grid, same type of thing, count on the x-axis, the y-axis, or the z, as well as the spacing. Okay, honeycomb is another mode we have. Really nice way of creating an interesting honeycomb shaped pattern. Works very well for placing hexagons inside of it. And once again, settings for the count, settings for the width. Now, the only other mode in here that I haven't talked about is object. And that allows you to create clones onto an existing piece of geometry. So that's a little bit more complex, but that's really what that is used for. I am going to go back to grid here. And the settings I'm going to use for this, I'm just going to increase the count on the X as well as the Y and get rid of any on the Z. I'll just leave that one copy there or clone. It's probably a bit too much, so I'll go down to say something like 15. Next up, if I place a second object inside of our cloner, notice how we get a regular pattern. And that is due to this option right here, where we are telling the clones to iterate for each copy. So it's literally just going sphere, cube, and just repeating that for however many clones I've created. Now you can do random, okay, which does try to randomize it. You can also do blend, though that will only work if the objects have the same number of polygons and they're ordered the same way. So it's not just two completely different objects. Sort is something else as well. Not really what something we need to cover in the beginner's guide. So I'll put this back to iterate. I'll get rid of the sphere, leaving us with our cube with our grid here. And next up, we are going to create actually not something from our Mograph generators here, because there's one other Mograph object that we can apply effectors to, and that is our text. And I'm just pulling this up by left clicking on our icon. So if you choose text, this is the easiest way to make 3D type in Cinema 4D. I'm going to just scale this up just a bit by switching to my scale tool. But believe it or not, this is a Mograph object. It used to be called MoText and was in here. No idea why they moved it. But it's essentially a text spline in an extrude in a fracture object. So it's multiple things in one. So you have your object tab, which is all your text settings, your caps section, which is pretty much all your bevel cap section from the extrude object, multiple selections as well from an extrude, and then the ability to apply effectors in multiple ways, whether it's the entire object, individual lines, words, and letters. And that's something that you'll see in common with a lot of these Mograph objects, is that they will have some kind of effectors tab. Usually it's called effectors. In the case of text, since it has several different options, it's not. But this is how we apply effectors, which we will eventually do, is by dragging them in this list. And something we will do is it'll show us that we can apply multiple the same effector to multiple Mograph generators. So you can apply the same plane effector to this cloner to our text object. Okay. Really quickly about the text object, you can type in whatever you want it to say here. You can change the font down here. All right. So show card Gothic, maybe not. Let's go with, and my font options may look a bit different since it's pulling from my Adobe fonts from the Creative Cloud. So just keep that in mind. And then the rest of these options here, pretty straightforward. Also the same as our text spline. So you can have different alignments, different height, which is really the size, horizontal spacing, vertical, and even some advanced kerning options, where if you click on an object or on a letter, you can now make it taller, shorter, wider, skinnier, even move it up and down. And you can do that for all of these. So really nice options here if you are making all of your type in Cinema 4D. So I'm going to undo that though, because it was looking a bit strange. There we go. So that's our text generator. Next up, we have our fracture object. And the way I'm going to do that is say, take a text spline. Okay, scale it up as well. And as you'll see, the text spline is quite similar here. So maybe I'll just choose a different font so we can tell this one apart. So let's find something like Orbitron extra bold. And I'm going to make this editable by hitting C. So this is just like text you would bring over from Illustrator or somewhere else. I'm going to put this into an extrude by holding down Alt when I create an extrude. And then I will put it in a fracture object. And so the fracture object is meant to work on existing geometry. So not geometry we create, say, with a cloner or with our text object, but something else. It could be a polygon object. In this case, it can be text. And we'll see we'll be able to work with this pretty much the exact same way. The fracture object doesn't have too many settings here. It has the mode, which we'll talk about, and then the effectors tab, which is once again how we apply effectors. So I can kind of collapse that down. So we have those three elements created at the moment. Let's see. I think we'll do one more of these. Let's do Voronoi Fracture. So for that, I'm going to create, say, a sphere, move it over to the side here, scale it up, right? Position it right there, and put it in, our Voronoi Fracture. Okay. Voronoi Fracture, lots of settings. The one I'm going to point out at the moment is in the sources section. If you want to create more or less pieces here, all you do is select the point generator distribution and increase the point amount. Now, if it seems like I'm going fast over a lot of these objects, it is because there are so many. The good news is I have several videos diving into the cloner into MoText or text, into the fracture, into the Voronoi. So I do have more detailed videos that go into uh, yeah, more detail about these different objects as well as Mograph in general. So the whole point here was to create just a single video to kind of get somebody up and running with a number of these different objects, effectors, and fields. So feel free to dive in. I think I have a whole playlist, which I'll make sure is in the description with all my other Mograph videos. So that's our Voronoi fracture. The best way to shatter something, have it, separate into different organic looking pieces or chunks. And those chunks and pieces can be um, modified using effectors or dynamics. So another interesting way you can work with the Voronoi fracture. So those are the most common Mograph generators. Okay, now we didn't get to matrix or tracer or most minor mo instance, but these really are the big ones. So now let's talk about effectors. Effectors allow us to modify the position, scale, rotation, color, and sometimes other properties of our Mograph geometry here. And they do so in several different ways. Sometimes we can tell that from the name. So the plane effector here is really all about using fields. The group effector allows us to group several other effectors together. The formula effector allows you to use a mathematical formula. Think sine, cosine, tangent, all those things I tried to forget. You also have push apart, which pushes things apart. You have a random effector, which is a simplified noise pattern. You have the shader effector where you can load in a shader, an animation, a movie file, an image. You have a sound where you can load in a sound file. You have a step, which allows you to use a curve to incrementally change those properties: position, scale, rotation, color. Time uses time, kind of so on and so forth. Okay, so I'll probably only show a couple of these because there are so many similarities. And on top of that, what you'll also see if I break these out here is that there's also a similarity in these fields. So these fields, like I said, are how you control the strength and apply the effector to our Mograph objects. And you can do that in several different ways. And these fields are really just one of them. Those are the main way we're going to be talking about today. But notice there is some overlap between our fields and between our effectors. So we have a random field, we have a random effector, we have a sound field, sound effector. Not that I've ever used it, but there's a Python field as well as a Python effector. Formula field, formula effector, group. So hopefully you're getting the idea. There is quite a bit of overlap here. And so it can be a bit tricky to figure out when you want to use one versus the other. My general recommendation is, if possible, use the field version since it is a bit newer and may have just a few more features or possibilities. Now, that isn't always the case, but it's definitely true for, say, the random field. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why I use it versus the random effector. There's a couple others as well. There's a way to add a delay kind of field wise, which I might have a chance to talk about. But yeah, ultimately, I try to use fields more and use a simpler effector, which typically means the plane effector. Now, there are two ways to apply an effector. You can create one by just clicking on that or from our effector menu here. I should also point out we have our whole Mograph menu here where you have your generators and your effectors. I won't be getting into the Mograph deformers. Those are a little bit different. But once you have created an effector, you can then select an object and then drag that effector into its effector list. And you should see it change. Usually these have some kind of default value which modify or change the Mograph generator you would apply to. And in the case of my cloner, it just moved it up a little bit on the y-axis. You can also toggle effectors on and off inside the effector list. Not all that different than just checking the checkbox here. And so that's the main way you can apply effectors. And that's really the way I prefer because it's not confusing. The other way, which can be a bit confusing, especially if you have multiple Mograph generators in something like this, is to select your Mograph generator and now create your effector. So if I select my cloner, and that's when I create my plane effector, it automatically gets applied for me. So that can be very nice, but I need to make sure I have the right Mograph generator selected and I don't have the incorrect one selected. So that's why I like just being able to drag it in, because I can just make sure I'm doing this exactly the way I want. Now, as I mentioned, you can drag in an effector to multiple Mograph generators here. So this same plane effector is now applied to both my Voronoi fracture and my cloner. I'm going to turn that off and delete that out for right now, because I do want to talk about our plane effector here. The Effector tab for this particular effector doesn't have a whole lot going on here, because this is where you find unique properties that are specific to whatever effector you're in. So the sound effector has a lot of things in the Effector tab. The random has a few. Same with the formula. Okay. The parameter tab, this is pretty standard for just about all of the effectors. This is where you are telling the effector what you want it to modify, whether that's the position, rotation, scale, or color. Okay, now color right now is set to fields, but you can also do it in the effector. We'll see the color in our fields a little bit later. But yes, we can see whether we want to modify the position, rotation, and see how each clone is now rotating, or scale. Okay, you can scale on individual axes or uniformly if you check that. All right. One thing I want to point out with our effector is how it's doing the exact same thing to each clone here. Each clone is being moved 100 centimeters up on the y-axis, rotated that many degrees on the heading and pitch axis, as well as being scaled that much. Okay. So that is kind of the important aspect of the parameter tab. Obviously, there's more going on here, some more advanced things down below. Not going to worry about those. After all, this is just the beginner's guide. Next, we have our fields section. As I've talked about, the fields are how we control the strength. Now, you may be going, well, wait a second. Here are all our fields. What are these other things? I would think of these very similar to other layers you could create in, say, After Effects, where these field layers, for instance, are ways to use other objects in Cinema 4D to control the strength of our effector, whether it's another Mograph object, a particle system, a piece of geometry, a spline object, or something else. We have modifier layers, which are very similar to adjustment layers. And we also have our delay in here, which is very similar to our delay effector. Okay. These allow us to, once again, kind of modify. So if we're close to what we want and need to push things a little bit further, tone them down a little bit, make some minor modifications, this can be a good way to do that, though you can usually do that in the field as well. So what we need to do is create a field, and I'm going to create actually a box field. So I'm going to left click and hold and choose box field here. Now this box field looks a bit small. So what I'm going to do is just switch to my scale tool and scale it up. And as I do that, you will see more and more of our clones change their position, change their scale, rotation, also their color. Okay, so we added this box field here. Now we can work with our fields in different layers. Something that's important to point out about fields is this association is what's important. Our box field being a child of the plane, not important. It does not need to be that way. In fact, you could create a field from here, and as long as you dragged it into your field list here, it would work the exact same way. All right. Now, we do have the ability to change the size of our field. I'll come back to the remapping as well as the color remap. But we do have the ability to turn on and off value. So if we're going to use this field to change the position, scale, or rotation, or color. So if we want to turn on or off color. Now this isn't a material color. That's something you can take this color and use it in a material, but it requires an additional step inside whatever material you're working with. But if you don't want the color, you can turn that off. We have different blending modes here. Definitely thinking about making a video going through all of these, as they can be a little bit more complicated in this kind of situation, as well as opacity. Because like I said, you can, actually, I don't think I've said it, but you can add multiple fields here in your field list, work with blending modes, opacity, very much like layers in an Adobe application. Okay, so we've talked about that. So what is actually happening with our box field? So our box field really consists of two shapes, and I'm just going to move this off to the side so we can see those shapes a little bit better. We have an outer shape and an inner shape. So clones that are inside the outer shape will start to have the effector applied. And that strength will increase until they reach the inside of our second shape, that inner shape. Once clones are inside that inner shape, they will have the effector applied 100%. And we can kind of visualize that a little bit based on the color, how the color gets more and more saturated as you get closer. Now, that color is being controlled by the color remap section here. You can go in and change the color to whatever you want. I don't really use the colors in my materials all that much. So, for visual purposes, I like something that has a very high saturation and a very high value. That way, I can see that transition. Okay. If that transition isn't, if my color is very saturated, it just doesn't look quite right. Although, honestly, that doesn't look bad. So, choosing a color, can make a little bit of a difference just in terms of how things look visually as we're working with this, but it isn't a big deal here. We can also switch the color mode to gradient. And I think this is another way to kind of visualize what we have going on here, where clones outside our outer square have 0%, hence their color black applied to them. And as we get more inside, they're going to get brighter until eventually white when they're inside that inner shape. Okay. So gradient can also be useful because it's, essentially what these are just masks, 2D masks, in this case, a 3D mask because things have to be inside the cube. And that's really the way I would think about them. Okay. I'm going to go back to color remapping though, now to the remapping section, because we can change how we're getting from 0 to 100. And the way I would think about those is with keyframes. And in fact, if I just delete that box field and then choose, say, a linear field so we can see what that looks like, I think this is a little bit better of a visual representation when it comes to thinking of our field also as keyframes. So I'm going to move this up. And in order to scale this thing, the icon up correctly, I am going to have to switch to object mode here. So I can do that and then scale this up a little bit. There is a property in our field to control the length. Each field will have its own properties, whether it's for size, sometimes orientation or direction, depending on the shape. But notice remapping is there, even though it looks a bit different, and the color remap is still there. And don't know why I know exactly why that color changed, but I'm going to change it back. And now we can see a little bit easier 0, 100. First keyframe, second keyframe. And if we think of these like keyframes, then this becomes the interpolation between those keyframes. And just how, when it comes to our keyframes, we don't want to have linear interpolation unless we have a good reason for it. The same is true for the remapping here. And in fact, if we want to be able to visualize that remapping a little bit, I'm going to come into my plane effector in the parameter tab and set this on the z-axis to something quite a bit. Maybe even check off rotation and scale just so we can visualize this a little bit more. But notice now how that is that straight line. And it is the same straight line I am seeing in my remapping section. I'm going to get rid of that box field. So what we can do is work with this in a number of ways, whether it's the strength, okay, whether it's the inner offset, which isn't quite as important here, but for the box field, I'll undo that to bring that box field back. That inner offset is actually where that second shape is, that inner shape is. Okay, so that can be important. Right. Back to our linear field. You do have a minimum you can work with, just like we just had strength, maximum as well, same type of thing. It's not really until this contour section that we can affect this line in other ways by making it shorter or taller. And there's a couple different ways you can do that. I won't go through all of these, but quadratic allows you to curve them in one direction negative, the other direction positive. And if you really want to work with these as keyframes, you can absolutely switch this to curve, and then you have 2 points, or more, because you can control click and add additional points, and Bezier handles. This absolutely has an impact on the way our animation looks. So between curve and quadratic, those are the main ways I work with this step. And quantize are very much like the step or hold interpolation we have, though you have a little bit more control because you can add multiple steps in there. So that can be an interesting way of having these move. And the way we typically create animation with these fields is, especially the linear field, by animating its position. Okay, so nothing in the remapping section or the parameter tab of the field, but typically the field itself. And like I said, in the case of this linear field, definitely going to be our X position. Okay, so I think I will go over one more effector. Let's see, random effector maybe. Yeah, why don't we do the random effector? So what I'm going to do is turn off my plane just so it's no longer there, and also hide our linear field so we don't see that either. And so this will give us a chance to use the random effector because we haven't applied anything to our other objects yet. Okay, so what I'm going to do is create a random effector, make sure I have nothing selected, come over here to effectors, choose random, and then I'm going to go one by one here, select my Voronoi Fracture, go into the Effectors tab, drag our random in there. Notice how that is the default value there. So now when I choose my fracture, random on that, that actually didn't work quite right. Everything's being treated as a single object. And that has to do with the fracture. The fracture, I talked about its one setting here being the mode. Well, that's because we need to change this mode based on how we've placed things inside of it. If you have a null object with a bunch of things inside, or multiple objects inside the extrude, you probably won't have to do this. But if you have just a single extrude with a single spline, it's going to treat it like a single object. So what we need to do is switch the mode here to explode segments or explode segments and connect. All right, they are different, but for our purposes today, they're really not that much different. And now we can see some randomization happening there. We shouldn't have to do that on the text, but like I said, we do need to decide how we want to apply this effector, whether it's the entire object, individual lines of text, individual words, or letters. I think letters is the best option usually, unless you have a whole bunch of text. So I will drag this effector in there. And now we can see things are randomized. I can go into my random effector here, back to the parameter tab, and wouldn't you know it, it looks the exact same. So I can go and maybe increase these values a little bit. And while we're at it, why don't we apply this to our cloner as well? Can't leave the cloner out. Perfect. Back in the parameter tab of our random effector, we could do rotation. Right? And one of the nice things about this random effector is it can make things look unique because we can scale them, rotate them all differently. Cubes, or if you place a single object in a cloner, can look different. We really wouldn't want to do that for text. In fact, I'd probably want to do uniform scale, if anything, and then set this to like negative 0.5. Okay. So yeah, that can help make things look a little bit better. Fields tab, going to work the exact same way. We'll come back to that in just a second. Like I said, though, some effectors have unique properties in the Effectors tab. That is the case with our random here, where we can choose our random mode. Think of this like different random patterns. Now, we don't have as many here as we would in, say, our random field, which is typically what I like to use, and probably should have used this. All right, but it's going to work the same way. You could apply this random field in a plane effector, and it would randomize the properties there. But here in the field tab, notice we have all of our noise types. And something really important is you can loop this, where you can't loop the random effector. But aside from that, they work very, very similarly. I can switch this mode here to something like noise or turbulence, and that will actually give me some random movement. So that can be fun. Okay, and you can work with the speed and scale of that. But really what I want to do is just create a field. In this case, we'll go with a spherical field. And what you'll see is a lot of these fields work very similarly. So the sphere works pretty much just like our box field where it has the outer shape and the inner shape. And so now the only parts of these objects that are going to be randomized are the ones that are inside our field, okay? So you can see as I move this through, the clones are changing their shape, position, rotation, same with our text, as well as our our Voronoi fracture here. Another really important and useful kind of option in our fields in the remapping section is invert, okay? So for instance, things were only being affected by a random effector if they were inside this, okay? If I check invert, now the only things that aren't affected are inside of this, right? So depending on which way you want to work, one might make more sense than the other. And as I said with the last field, the linear field, typically it's position we might want to animate, all right, of our field. And on the spherical field, sometimes even the box field, the size as well can be something you want to animate, but it just depends, okay? So that is a quick look at several of our Mograph generators, as well as a couple of effectors and fields. So that will do it for this video. Like I said, I have plenty of other videos on Mograph if you want to dive into specific effectors, specific Mograph generators, and I'd highly encourage you to do so because I do spend more time going into them. But that will do it for this video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If there's anything else you would like to see, please let me know and take care.